Demon Mama. This name causes so much contention in spaces like in Discord and everything else. For whatever reason, some people really dislike her. And I'll just say that for the record, I enjoy her content. I think that Demon Mama puts out like a lot of good stuff. If you haven't checked her out, I don't know how like you would know about me, but not know about her. But if you have not, check out her channel, Demon Mama, exactly as it sounds. Now, a few months ago, and when I say a few, I mean this video was posted back in May. It was part of a stream that she did, and she talked about self-diagnosis. Now, I've been thinking a lot recently about mental health conditions, as I myself am currently in therapy. Who could have guessed? And one of the things that I've thought about a lot was this very take from her, because I keep seeing people commenting either on responding to her on Twitter, or they're responding to people that surround her, like her friends and family and whatnot, about this take of hers. And I started thinking to myself, I was like, was it that awful? So instead of just telling you what I think about self-diagnosis in general, I figured it would be better to go back and watch the clip ourselves, and then I'll comment on it while she's talking about it, and then we can kind of see like toward the end, because I do actually have an opinion on this. And even though I like Demon Mama, I'm going to offer her some friendly critique while she's going over this, because while I agree kind of overall with her, and do not at me in my comments yet until you watch the entire video, because I also have a clip that I'm going to show of an actual licensed therapist talking about this very same issue. Because a lot of people that were kind of reactionary and trying to dunk on her and saying that this was so awful, I'm assuming are probably going to do the exact same sort of thing to me if I were to just go out and say, oh yes, I agree with this, and just like co-sign onto it. So I'm not going to do that. I do actually have some critiques on this. However, I also wanted to have a viewpoint from an actual licensed therapist and hear their words about this. And once you take the whole picture into it, then you can consider whether you actually do or do not disagree with the idea of self-diagnosis. So that being said, I hope that if DM ever watches this or somebody sends this to her or whatever else, she realizes that this is absolutely in good faith. I mean, like, I'm not trying to fire shots at her or anything else. And I just want to go ahead and, I guess, add my voice to this. I've avoided talking about this subject. I mean, like, since this clip came out, I never got involved with it. I don't think I ever tweeted about it or anything else. But I'm getting tired of watching people kind of like fire shots at her that just seem like completely unfounded or unfair. And with that, let's take it away.
Everybody who had a mental illness, who has a diagnosis for a mental illness, was at one point undiagnosed.
Yeah, so that's the first point, and I think that's true, right? We all have to recognize that at one point in time, no matter what it is, if you have a diagnosis now, at one point in time, you weren't diagnosed. So there's nothing wrong with that.
And was also, at one point, self-diagnosed. I'm serious. In fact, that is a good thing, okay? It is a good thing to be able to analyze your own brain, to come to conclusions. Will some people do so poorly? Of course. Their competence is an issue across the board.
Yeah, and so this is like the kind of like the very heart of the issue that blew up from this. And I think that it's a fair point that she's making, that before you go and get a diagnosis, it's important that you recognize symptoms in yourself, and then you can go and you can seek that diagnosis or seek treatment. I don't have a problem with any of that, but we're going to see what she follows this up with.
People can incorrectly self-diagnose themselves, but at the end of the day, the key political takeaway is that we have to. Self-diagnosis is essential to the process of actual medical diagnosis.
Sure, to some extent, I would agree with that, because in order to seek out a diagnosis, you must first have to recognize that there is something wrong with you to begin with. Otherwise, how would you do that? The real problem is exactly what she's getting at here, is the competence of the person making the observation about what's wrong with them. Because either one, they might not recognize that the behavior that they're engaging in is problematic to begin with, or two, they might misattribute their problematic behavior to some other aspect of their personality, and therefore they actually miss the mark and they don't know why they're doing the thing that they're doing. They just kind of take a guess at it, and then they diagnose based off of that guess and not any type of evaluation to find out if there's any validity to it or not. However, I think it's fair. Like, if I have a headache, I'm just going to go take some Tylenol or something. That's me diagnosing that I have pain. It's in my head. I need to take some medication, whatever. And I know exactly what medication to take for it. So I don't think that there's anything particularly wrong with that.
Self-diagnosis is arguably more important. And we should hope to encourage accurate and helpful self-diagnosis because...
Okay, why would it be more important? And I think, like, I wish that she had elaborated a little bit on this. Part of the reason why I think that self-diagnosis is very important in this area is because if you self-diagnose it, that means that you're recognizing that there is a problem that you have. And if you don't self-diagnose it, so let's say, like, for instance, like, your family just takes you to a psychiatrist, like you're a minor or something, they take you to a psychologist and they say, like, hey, can you evaluate our teenager or whatever? The problem with that is that if it's not you self-diagnosing and it's not you seeking out that treatment, the patient can be more resistant to any type of treatment, including diagnosis. You might diagnose them with whatever, like schizophrenia or something. And the patient, like, regarding of how well their reception is to that, I do think, like, self-diagnosis plays a part in that. Like, if they recognize already that I have some issues going on, or they're afraid to talk about certain issues because it makes them, like, it could trigger them in some sort of way, that recognizing that is a very important first step in order to get treatment. Because if you recognize that there is a problem, then you will agree to go get treatment. Now, the people that had a really harsh take on this, I thought it was kind of silly because a lot of them were implying that, well, what if this person needs medication? Like, what if they have to be medicated or whatever? There's only, like, when you're talking about, like, all of mental health, right? So if you're talking about, like, personality disorders, mood disorders, and all these sorts of things, only, like, a small category of them actually require diagnosis. Otherwise, like, or medication. I'm sorry, I misspoke there. It requires medication. Otherwise, you can use, like, psychotherapy or something like CBT or DBT or, like, talk therapy or whatever else. There are other methods you can use to reduce your symptoms and reduce the way that you're expressing things and managing your behavior other than just medication. Like, I don't know if y'all remember this or not, but remember when you were a kid and it was like, oh, all of a sudden there's all these, like, hyperactive kids and all of a sudden, like, everyone's being diagnosed with Ritalin or some type of drug like that. And it's like, these drugs will help calm your child down, will reduce their anxiety, whatever else. And everyone was getting it. And it was based on parents just going, oh, my kid is hyperactive, taking them to a psychiatrist or some type of doctor. And the doctor goes, yep, your kid is very hyperactive, seems abnormal. And they pencil whipped a prescription for Ritalin. So a huge amount of kids that did not need to be on Ritalin or any type of drug like that got put on those drugs based on the diagnosis of their parents, which was then reinforced by some type of clinician. So even in the case of, like, a parent and doctor, whatever, we still need to be cautious when it comes to just issuing medications. And that's where I think, like, a verification, a more robust verification process ought to come into it.
How can you possibly get a diagnosis if you're unable to be aware of your own situation? Right?
Well, I know with that one, you could get the diagnosis. So this is one of the problems I have with DM's take. And the problems I have are going to be splitting hairs. I'm more of, like, making this video because I'm tired of all the hate that she's been getting for this take. I don't see how it was especially bad, but it's like, if you read Twitter, you follow her, I mean, like, people, like, absolutely try to, like, cancel her for this and everything else. One of the problems I have with this kind of area specifically, not everyone is capable of being aware that there is a problem until they get medicated. Like, if they're in the throes of psychosis or they have some type of, symptoms that are going on, preventing them from recognizing, like, even some aspects of reality, they're going to have to get medication first before they can enter, like, psychotherapy or whatever else. But like I said before, those are limited cases. Those are only a small subset of mental health issues. And because I deal with, like, mental health issues myself, it is something, there is something to be said about the stigmatization of mental health, of seeking treatment, of admitting that you have these problems, because there is also the problem that once you get into a clinical setting and you recognize that you need some type of medication or whatever else, there's a lot of fear and paranoia that goes along with that about, well, what are these institutions going to continue to do to you? Like, how much agency are you about to lose if you walk in there and say, hey, I think I need to be medicated? And I think like that kind of white coat syndrome has some legitimacy there, especially because of the culture that that's very toxic, at least in America, surrounding even the idea of like mental well-being and mental health for people.
Do you know what that leads to? A world in which only doctors can make declarations about your well-being is a world of asylums and gatekeeping.
And yeah, I just mentioned the asylum portion of that, at least like one of the, as far where I see the problem being. But I agree with her a little bit there. Like the gatekeeping is a problem. I just don't know if it was like the route that I would have taken in making this point. And there is a lot to be said about gatekeeping as well, because if you recognize that there's something wrong with you, you go to talk to a doctor and they misdiagnose you, or they quickly diagnose you with something that completely surprises you. And you're like, that doesn't sound like, when you go back and you review the diagnosis, you're like, that doesn't sound like anything I experience. That's part of the problem. If they're not talking with you and this doctor isn't working with you to let you to give you the rationale about why they're diagnosing you with this, or where you're going, or they spend enough time diagnosing you. Like, for instance, I'll talk about this later because I mean, this video is like almost, like 6 months old. I'm aware at one point here, she talks about her history of mental health, and I'll talk about mine at that portion, but I do have something very relevant to say about this exact point.
Yes, I can elaborate more on what I mean by self-diagnosis. For example, I figured out that I had BPD long before I had a formal diagnosis for BPD.
Sure. And see, this is one of the things that people were talking about, because a lot of people are like trying to meme on her, like, oh, I know I have this thing and therefore I have it. The problem is that I went through a similar route with my own mental health in this. I recognize that some of the behaviors that I engaged in, some of the ways that I think about things, are not how the average person thinks about them. And I say average here because I don't want to say normal. I think that normal and abnormal terminology when we're talking about mental health issues ends up not being very helpful. And I feel like some of the problem that DM had here in these takes is that she does live streams. She doesn't just sit down and make videos. So a lot of this was just coming kind of off the cuff. And I felt like if she sat down and she really thought about it and chose like all the terms and stuff that she wanted to use precisely, I don't know if normality, abnormality, and stuff like that would ever show up. I would just say average. And because I had all this thinking and reactions and stuff outside of what would be the average range that people experience, I started recognizing like, hey, this might be like, there might be something more going on here. Why do I engage in these behaviors? And it was that self-reflection that initially like started me on the path of mental health to seek counseling and to seek a therapist.
Diagnosed myself by enlightening myself and having some people enlighten me to patterns in my life that were identical to that of BPD. And what happened is I went, oh my God, I recognize these cycles in myself. And I said, wait a second, there's a name for this and somebody might be able to help me with this. I diagnosed myself.
Yeah. Now, a lot of people will also say like, oh, well, there's, how much value is there in a diagnosis? Diagnosis is like a double-edged sword, right? So on one side of it, it's like, oh no, I've been diagnosed with some condition or whatever else. It is something that is, there's enough data that we can collect on it that we can say that I map onto some certain illness or whatever else. And there's a concern with that. Like, now that you've said it, people are going to associate this with you. And then on the flip side of it, it can be liberating because you're like, oh my, thank God there are other people like me and I'm not just alone in this world, and other people experience something similar enough that now there is a treatment path going forward and I can improve if I use mindfulness or whatever other mental exercises they might have you do, instead of just being hopeless and adrift or thinking I've been this way for the last 30 years and I see no change in the fact that I do not like my aggressive temperament. There's nothing I can do to alter that. Like, I've tried Zen meditations, and I've tried talking with people and expressing my feelings and stuff and taking a moment and thinking things through. But I still feel all this negativity and I still lash out at people, and I don't know why I do that. A diagnosis can help you along that route to say, okay, here's actually a solid plan to improve yourself.
And then I said, let's go talk to a doctor about this. And I started, once I figured out what problems I was struggling with, I was able to immediately start making positive changes in my life before I even talked to a doctor. Trans people always self-diagnose.
All right. So this is like the portion of it that I took a lot of umbrage with, and I'll say I thought was it's a poor analogy. When she says, and I say this with all love, Diva Mama, okay? When you say trans people always self-diagnose, there's the implication that being trans is diagnosable. And it's not. Identities are not diagnosable like that. You would diagnose gender dysphoria or somebody having, disliking their primary or secondary sexual characteristics, however that forms. Because there are some trans people that are trans, but they don't feel the need to transition their body because they don't have that dysphoria. And in a clinical setting, when we're talking about a diagnosis for gender dysphoria, that's all we're talking about. You don't like get a diagnosis for being trans. Like you don't get a diagnosis for your sexuality. Like, hey, sorry, we've collected some data on you, and we are giving you the diagnosis that you're actually a gay. It's like that doesn't happen. We don't diagnose heterosexuals. We don't diagnose people as being like straight, whatever. It's fine. It's going to sound like I'm being like really nitpicky here and stuff. But what I'm saying is we want to avoid like an equivocation, especially one that opens the door enough for someone to say, to imply that being trans is a mental illness, which is where you can get to if you jump from, oh, somebody self-diagnosed themselves as being trans, or that being trans ought to require a diagnosis. It does not take a diagnosis to be trans. And this, like I said, I understand, nitpicky, but I did not like this analogy.
Did you know that? In fact, arguably, that is the only way to be trans, right? We acknowledge that no one else gets to decide your gender. You get to decide your gender.
Yeah, but recognizing that you have an identity is not the same as being diagnosed with an identity. It's not even there's no equivalent. Like, because if you're saying that, well, you can self-diagnose like a mental illness like BPD, or you could go to a clinical setting, do enough interviews and blah, 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 and they'll eventually say, oh, we think that you have borderline personality. The same is not with like your gender, like you just said. The same is no one else can tell you this. Like internally, you know who you are. It's whether you outwardly communicate that or not. I don't think you can go to a psychiatrist, psychologist, whatever, and sit down and talk with them for a little bit and have them diagnose you as being trans. All they could do is say that you're saying things that sound similar to what some trans patients have said.
Which means you are intrinsically self-diagnosing if you decide that you are trans. Now, I acknowledge that there are some differences between structural medicine, like saying, here is this mental disorder that we have categorized, but we don't really care about that most of the time, right? What we actually care about is, people getting the help they need.
Well, sure, but at the same time, you also want to make sure that this is not a thing where somebody says, oh, I think I have BPD, and then they go to the therapist, and when the therapist starts talking to them, they make sure that they hit like all of the, every one of the criteria in order to get that diagnosis. Because, I mean, you can, if you're not careful, and this is obviously why clinicians want to do usually several series of talks with you before they diagnose you with anything. Like it might take several weeks or like a few months to get an actual clinical diagnosis. And it's because in just one interview of an hour, they're not going to be able to diagnose you. At least they shouldn't. If somebody does that, then you ought to get the fuck out there, go to another clinician. Just like if you get any diagnosis from any doctor that's a severe or serious diagnosis, always get a second opinion. Always. Now, if you're already like, I suspect I have this, and they go through like a couple of weeks or a few months worth of interviews and they say, hey, yeah, we're diagnosing this, what it is, that's fine. I mean, you just figured it out on your own. Good job. But there's also the problem that, and it is kind of like this self-fulfilling prophecy where you're like, I think I have this issue. You go to the clinician and then you tell them the things that would lead them to think that you have this illness. We have to be careful with that one, which is, by the way, that I would say is another difference between being trans and having a mental illness, is because like you do recognize that on the inside that you are trans, and that when people are going to ask you about your identity, you are going to explain to them how you got there and why you feel like this identity matches you. It's not the same as a mental illness.
Figuring out their own minds and living a better life for it. Now, I will agree that obviously, like, you know, there are certain circumstances in which, you know, it's important to have some level of structure or institutionalization or whatever. However, self-diagnosis is incredibly, incredibly important. And I think that discouraging self-diagnosis in the name of denouncing a handful of potentially existent Tumblr people who maybe put a million things in their bio, maybe so that they can win the oppression Olympics, is a huge mistake, right?
Yeah, but I think like you're also jumping the shark a little bit, just a little bit, because I get that you're concerned about people like Destiny or whatever that will absolutely go after people that have like certain illnesses or whatever, listen to bio. And, you know, he'll tweet out like whatever, like, oh, I have like a whole bunch of genders and like 8 different illnesses or whatever else. One of the things that I wish that she had pointed out here is that a lot of diagnoses are not standalone diagnosis. Like it's very rare for somebody to have a diagnosis of just borderline personality disorder. Now, she has shared openly before that she has borderline. I'm fine with, so I'm not just like saying this just to put on blast, whatever. What I will say is very rare for someone that just have BPD. And there's usually like a cluster of other disorders that go with them. And she hasn't shared that. So I'm not going to extrapolate anything based on behaviors or nothing like that. It's up to her, whatever she wants to disclose or share. That's it. I'm not going to sit here and pretend to mind read people and know what their personality is or whatever they're dealing with. But I will say, like, I wish she had mentioned that here, because I feel like it's very disingenuous for those people to say, oh, somebody on Tumblr that lists like 6 or 7 different mental issues, and these people are just absolutely off the wall and they're self-diagnosing all this stuff. It's like, look, if you have one diagnosis for one, chances are you have gotten diagnosed with other things as well. It's not just one single personality disorder. And in that case, I think it's very disingenuous. Like, I have like a primary disorder that I have, and I have like a couple of others that my therapist is talking with me about whether they're going to actually diagnose me or not. But I'm aware that these are the things that they're considering. It's not unusual for people to have like 4 to 6 different diagnoses at the same time. Like you could have 4 or 6 different components, because there's so much overlap between a lot of these different disorders that sometimes when you meet the criteria for one, you're automatically going to have already have met, especially if it's considered like, if it's a very dysfunctional disorder, chances are you've already also hit, you know, the nails on other disorders leading up to that one.
Right? It is a mistake to give up the importance of self-diagnosis, to downplay the importance of self-diagnosis in the name of denouncing some random idiots on Tumblr or whatever. Okay?
Yeah, no, I agree with that one. We should not, like, this is like, I wish this is what people had taken away from this segment of what she had said. Self-diagnosis is crucially important as a first step. If you can get to your, you know, mental health journey by starting with self-diagnosis, that can lead you to be a lot more motivated. You can pursue treatment a lot more because you recognize that there is an issue there. The worst thing that somebody can take about self-diagnosis is to say like, oh, look, everybody that I don't like is mentally ill or whatever. And this is very commonplace, especially on Twitter and online spaces. People will just continuously attack other people by speculating like, whoa, maybe this person is mentally ill or whatever else. I wish it didn't happen. But it does happen, and that is what she's talking about, especially because a lot of people that attack the queer community and trans people will say that we are all mentally ill, which is one of the only reasons why, like, because she's making this point, I'm going to make the point that being trans is not diagnosable in regards to what she said earlier. And the reason I'm pushing back on that is because there is this crappy narrative out there that all trans people are mentally ill.
Okay? I think that's a mistake. Okay? Just like I think it's a mistake to pass up on self-ID for trans people in the name of clamping down on so-called trans trenders. We're going to get there, Alias. We'll get there. It'll all tie together, okay? It is the same. There is no difference between the trenders and this. My problem with self-diagnosis is that I feel it lessens to credibility doctors have in diagnosing. Like a doctor is really the main person who can diagnose. No. No, it's not actually. Especially, maybe in some alternate future where doctors are universal and also benevolent all through and through.
Yeah, access to care and assuming that every single clinician is going to be benevolent toward their patients is an absurd idea. Even clinicians have biases. You know, they've got personalities that might clash with their patients or whatever else. I think a lot of people that have never been in mental health settings and they're only aware of it through like watching movies or I don't know, they assume that everybody in medicine is just these like impartial judges about their patients or whatever. What I would point out to them is that there's a reason why a lot of clinicians, especially if they are good, they will tell you that the doctor-patient relationship in mental health is one of the most crucial aspects and best predictors about how good your treatment will go. Because if you don't get along with your therapist or your therapist doesn't like you for whatever reason, your treatment is not going to go very well, especially if it requires like psychotherapy or talk therapy, where they have to talk and listen to you for long periods of time. Or you have to feel safe enough to trust them to communicate what's really going on or what you're feeling, or whatever else. And you don't downplay the severity of some of the issues that you are facing. I wish it wasn't this way. And I wish that all clinicians could be impartial judges about, mental health and offer people the most compassionate care they can. But this is just not the reality of what we're faced. And it's not an anti-intellectual stance or anything. It's a recognizing these clinicians are human. It's not as easy as going to a doctor or a medical doctor, I should say, like GP, and they say like, oh, you have whatever injury, here's penicillin or something, and they give that to you, and the penicillin will impartially treat you. Psychiatrists and therapists, they're not penicillin. They're not medication in and of themselves. They're there to aid you in recovering on your journey to mental health. They are not like, not only are they not the diagnosis, like they can't be the diagnosis and the cure at the same time. They can help you along the way and maybe offer you some medications if it's really necessary, but at the same time, they are not impartial.
Reality is that most people do not have access to diagnosis. They do not have access to doctors. They do not have access to good doctors with modern training. Instead, they are left on their own. So it is important for us to teach people how to self-diagnose and how to then find any further help if they need it. But the reality is, think about it like this. There's a couple of different things, right? Like, for example, think of how much of the world currently relies on people being able to self-diagnose things like COVID, right? They go, oh shit, I've got a fever, I'm coughing, I need to go get medical help because I have diagnosed with some level of certainty that I have the symptoms. A doctor has more expertise on that, which is why we generally take their diagnosis more seriously, but that doesn't mean that self-diagnosis isn't important.
But that's for something like, like COVID, you're talking like fever, sneezing, cold, coughing, whatever. And I think like everyone would agree with that. If anyone doesn't agree with this portion, I think like they're just being spiteful idiots. because all of us do this. And it's not, this is something I don't even see how someone would argue against it.
Self-diagnosis leads to self-treatment. Hot take. Ready? Everybody's going to cancel me for this one. Ready? Ready?
Yeah, and you've continuously received like an unreasonable amount of hate for this, but I'm sorry, DM.
Now here's the hot take. You're going to cancel me for this one. You're going to cancel me for this one. All of life is self-treatment. That is all that anybody ever does. All of their life is self-treatment. Ideally, we want people to self-treat with reason. With reason, okay? We don't want people to self-treat cancer because no person can do that. We want people to self-treat headaches. We want people to self-treat depression by exercising. Now, if it gets to the point where they can't do it themselves, they're supposed to seek help.
Yeah, but see, I wish, and this is like the one thing, I wish that she had taken some time to say that what she's not talking about is like homeopathy or like home remedies instead of actually going and getting like real medical help or whatever else. Because I do know some people, you say like, well, you cannot like self-treat cancer or whatever. There are people that think that you can just take some, mix of like berries and nuts and fruit and whatever, and you'll treat something like cancer, where they think like, all the like the goop and stuff that is marketed to people that believe this type of stuff, or healing crystals. Like you missed a really good opportunity here to just call out that, the area of homeopathy and the false medications that people believe, or I would say the panaceas that they think will cure whatever illness that they have, instead of actually going to the doctor. And that if you detect that there is something wrong with you, that you should then go to the doctor to verify this or get treatment, whatever else, if you cannot treat it with over-the-counter medication like Tylenol, whatever else. But don't rely on like woo, like healing crystals or something like that. This was a crucial point that allowed a lot of people to come in behind her and say, oh, well, you're empowering anti-vaxxers or whatever else. She never did that. She never said that. Nothing that she said could you construe to that. But what I'm saying is she just failed to address that at that point, because there are, especially because she brought up COVID, we know that there's more and more and more of these anti-vaxxers. That position is becoming more popular, and that's more dangerous. I really wish you would have cautioned that if you are going to self-diagnose, make sure that, especially if the diagnosis like runs against what our best sciences say, that you go and get it confirmed or whatever else. Don't just say like, oh, I think I have, like you have the sniffles and you have a fever, temperature, whatever. And then you go like, no, I don't have COVID. And your family or your wife is like, well, wait a minute, you're coughing and you seem like pretty sick and you have a high fever or whatever. Yeah, but I know it's not COVID. It's just a headache or something. I wish that this is the only caveat that she had added to this, was like, if your judgment runs against what conventional wisdom says, especially the consensus of science, you should go and talk to a doctor or whatever, because like humans are very bad to intuitively just know what's like necessarily medically what's wrong with them. We have an idea to say, well, something hurts, or that I feel pain XYZ, but I would say something like COVID, that's a physical illness and not just something that's mental. That I would say is a little bit different.
And if you are treating yourself incorrectly, we would love you to be able to correct that. But the reality is, a lot of life is developing healthy self-treatment. Don't perform surgery on yourself, but that's an example of something where surgery isn't the majority of what people deal with.
Yeah, but nobody's going to self-diagnose that they need like, I don't know, a portion of their liver removed or whatever. They'll just say, oh, I have like an intense pain in my side. That's like, I hope that it just kind of like builds on to what I was saying. You could say I'm experiencing pain in whatever area, then go and get that like confirmed by a doctor to find out whatever it is. I mean, I know she's being glib to be like, well, don't do surgery on yourself. It's like, I mean, some people have tried. So it's like, we know that there are some people that are dumb enough that they'll use like, they try to perform like a liposuction with like a shop vac or something. So because there are these people that exist, I think there does need to be a warning label on this advice, just a little bit, to say, hey, don't do something that's radically stupid.
The majority of what people deal with is, oh my God, I've got hemorrhoids. And what they should do is they should get some Preparation H and a fucking shit stool. There you go. Bam. Oh my God, I have a rash. Okay, put some cream on it. You know, keep it dry. Take care of yourself. Now, there are obviously extremes of this. We don't want people to avoid going to experts, but people avoid going to experts when they are scared of experts. And the best way to guarantee that people are scared of experts is by making experts evil gatekeepers who wait for you to walk in and go, yes, I'm sorry. You don't qualify for help. You'll have to die in the streets. You don't want your fucking doctor looking like this motherfucker. Okay?
And I would also say, like, to add on to that, I think, like, there ought to be, like, legal ramifications to say, like, what a doctor can and cannot if they deny you, like, medical care. I know, like, a lot of states have where they say, well, in emergencies, they can't deny you. I don't think a lot of people recognize how many different treatments that the doctor can just be like, oh, no, you don't need that, or it's their judgment. Like, for instance, this is just a side tangent. Some years ago, I was having pain in my forearm, and I was like, I mean, every day, then I noticed that there was like a little like lump in it. So I went to my dermatologist, and I was like, hey, I've got some unusual like swelling going on my arm. And I was like, I think maybe you should take it out and do a biopsy. My dermatologist, so we're talking a specialist and not just like a GP, he said in his opinion that it's probably something benign and I don't need to worry about it because lymph nodes get swollen or whatever else. And I told him, like, no, I feel like I'm having pain and I feel like you ought to remove this thing and at least have it tested. He disagreed with me. So I told him flatly that if he didn't have the skill to do it, then I would go to somebody else that knew how to do it and I would have them do it. And when I offended his ego, he agreed to cut out a piece of it and send it off to the lab. The results came back and I immediately was sent to a cancer specialist to have that node cut out of my body. I'm not going to go any more into my diagnosis or anything that. I'll just say that I feel like this is the kind of thing that she's talking about. You don't recognize how often specialists can tell you, or doctors will say like, oh no, you don't actually need this thing. If you feel like you need a procedure, that's why I said always get a second opinion, period. If that dermatologist told me no and refused to do it, I would have gone to another dermatologist and then got their opinion about it as well. Because while it's true that any single dermatologist is going to know way more about medicine than I'm going to know, I know enough about my own body to understand that I'm in pain or that there's something wrong that was not in my arm before. It's in my arm now. It causes me pain. I want it removed. It really is that simple.
Okay? You don't want your fucking doctor. If you walk into your doctor, okay, and this is who you see, okay? You walk into your fucking doctor and this dude is like, oh yeah, your leg hurts? I don't believe you. Go die. If you walk in and this motherfucker is your doctor, you're never going to go to the doctor when you need it.
Yeah.
Imagine
Quality care.
Imagine if you, wait a second, hold on. I got another thing. Ready? Imagine if you are struggling with depression, okay? And you know you can't handle it yourself anymore. Your approach to it isn't working and you want to seek out help. And the only guy that you can find is a guy with a million plaques on his wall and a huge suit and a big bushy beard. And when you come in, he gives you a stern look and goes, "Have you been drinking your water lately? You say you're depressed, yet you smiled the other day. That seems suspicious." Well, guess what? That is the reality for trans people, mentally ill people, and a lot of people who are suffering from physical disabilities.
Yeah, so just I would point out, I actually had an experience whenever I was a teenager that I was sent to a doctor, and he was a Christian psychiatrist. And sitting down and talking with him, and then him looking at notes from what I guess like my mother had said about me. He looked over these notes. Within a single session, diagnosed me with having a pretty severe personality disorder. I was under 18, so I was a teenager, and he had barely done half an interview, so he talked with me for maybe 25, 30 minutes before he decided to give me this diagnosis. I mean, that's against most standard care practices. Like, if you tell it to any therapist, like I've talked to my therapist since, and they all told me like that was absolutely crazy. Like, what did you do? And I was like, I didn't fucking believe him. Like, I was just like, I'm sorry, you barely even know me. How could you have talked to me for 20 minutes and already come to this conclusion? So there is, some merit to that we do need to be careful of. It's not like these people are infallible or anything.
Okay? That is the experience, because as it turns out, institutional gatekeeping focus of finding out who is the true sufferers is a really bad way of approaching things, okay? And I recognize, by the way, just so you know, I recognize that Vosh was not Vosh was not making an argument in favor of these things.
This clip is out of a stream that she did where she was responding to Vosh as well as some other stuff. I'll go ahead and I will post the link to her video in my description if you want to go and you want to watch it. This area was specifically like, I want to say like 2 hours and 30 minutes in or something like that, but it was like a 4 or 5 hour stream. That's why obviously I'm not going to watch the entire thing. I just want to go over this segment. And hopefully you're getting the feeling now that you're like, she got canceled for months. People have continued to go after her for this. Yes, they did. And they continue to do so. And that's part of the reason why I felt like I wanted to go ahead and make my own critique of this and also to comment on it, because I feel like it was treated way worse than it actually was. And I wanted to play enough of it to give you the full context of it, instead of just me doing a video talking about what my opinions are on mental health issues, then just kind of mentioning that this happened to D-Mom. Instead, I wanted you to actually see the content as well.
But this is why I am challenging his take on this, because I think his take, even though it doesn't seem like it, does ultimately contribute to this approach with regard to plural folks. We'll get there a bit further, okay? Yes, in fact, that's happening constantly, D+, and it's gotten better over the years. We're making progress, okay? So we're going to keep going, and we're going to talk about some other things as this goes on, okay? Sorry, this is going to be a lot of ranting and whatever. Isn't it important to understand why things happen? Yes, but that is not in conflict with what we're talking about here. Yes, I know. Yes, I agree. Yes, that happens all the time on Yashi. I've had friends with their depression shrugged off because they lack the social skills to communicate their feelings, probably when suicidal.
Yeah, or they don't trust the doctor. Like they don't have that trust with their therapist, and like, I don't know what this person's going to do if I tell them like exactly like how my suicidal ideation is feeling right now.
Do you want to know why that is? That's because a lot of times people they write off children, cringiness. They write those things off.
I mean, part of the reason, so when she says children right here, I just have to say it again. Part of the reason why they don't necessarily diagnose like personality disorders and stuff like that is because a child's mind is still like shaping and developing as they're getting older. Most doctors will not give anybody that is a minor a clinical formal diagnosis of anything unless it is like a very persistent thing. And I guess there's like overwhelming evidence that this is what the kid is suffering, or this seems to be a mode of their personality that they are not going to grow out of. That's the only caveat to this part.
As degenerate and hilarious, as opposed to potentially just an abnormal way of communicating. Anyway, let's continue.
All right. So she is switching back over to Vosh. And while she does that, I'm going to pull up Katie Morton. Now, Katie Morton is a clinical psychologist. She practices medicine. She has over 1 million subscribers. And somebody asked her this exact question on self-diagnosis. So now that you heard Demon Mama's take, and now that I've kind of given my take here and there, I'm also going to go ahead and let's hear it from Katie, who is a psychologist.
I've already had my coffee, but the question is, hey Katie, I was wondering about your stance on the increased prevalence of self-diagnosis. Ooh, so
That sounds familiar, right? Self-diagnosis.
interesting. What should those who can't afford a therapist/psychiatrist do, and how should they go about seeking communities to seek advice from? Thank you. This is a loaded question for me because
Okay.
unlike most professionals, I actually interact online and I recognize how shitty a lot of treatments are in different countries and in the States. Mental health, we're gonna change it, guys. We're gonna,
Yeah, so the system of mental health is not where it ought to be. And Katie recognizes this. And I did not pick her just because it's like, oh, she just so happens to have a lot of overlap with the position that I share. And also it seems like DM shares. I wanted to pick her because she has so many followers and I've been watching her content for quite a while. I feel like if you are interested in mental health content and living healthier lives, then I highly suggest to also go over and subscribe to Katie's channel. But at the same time, she's very qualified. She's very good at what she does. And a lot of people have gotten help and seen her content as very valuable. And I think that's the voice that I wanted to bring here, not just some arbitrary clinician, but somebody who is online a lot, that has delved into a lot of online communities as she has. She's done surveys and obviously she's done AMAs and she's talked to a lot of different like mental health communities and online spaces like BPD communities and that sort of stuff. So she is familiar with the online culture of mental health care and not just as a clinician.
make the change, be the change, right? But for now, we're stuck in some not so desirable situations, and it can be really difficult to get help. And I understand that it's not available to all, whether our parents aren't supporting it, so financially it's not available, or we're adults and we can't afford it. A lot of us are on a tight budget. I'm on a tight budget, and it can be hard to afford it. Insurances suck. Socialized medicine sucks. We wait forever. I totally get it. Like there are a lot of scenarios where getting properly treated and diagnosed just isn't available. And so let's start with that. With that in mind, that for a lot of us it's not available, it's not something that we have access to, it's not something that we can get, or if we've gone to see someone, they don't listen to us and they fall asleep or something horrible. I've heard some horrible stories, you guys.
Yeah, and that was the point that Diamond was making earlier, where she's like, I mean, can you imagine going to talk to a therapist and they fall asleep while you're talking to them, supposed to be getting your counseling? And by the way, these services are not cheap at all. I mean, like, it's prohibitively expensive. And I feel like that's something that, like, Destiny and, like, goons like him don't ever think about when they're criticizing Diamama on these things. Like, it's not unusual for a therapist to charge $100, $150 per hour. So it's like, if you only talk to them once a week and they're going to charge you that much, imagine if you needed like 3 times a week counseling. Now we're at like $450. And depending on how severe your illness is, you absolutely might need to talk to a counselor that many times a week. So it's like, being able to recognize that you need help can help get you to a counselor or therapist that can offer you the help, but it is prohibitively expensive for some people.
Self-diagnosing is okay with caution. I want you to understand that I know how helpful it can be just to feel that you have a label to put on what you've been feeling. Does that make sense? Like okay, I'm not crazy. I just have anxiety.
Yeah, it's because you might feel like anxiety, for instance, but not recognize that what you're feeling is anxiety. You might feel like, I just feel tense, my palms get sweaty, I lay in bed at night and I can't go to sleep, or when I do go to sleep, I wake up like soon after. And you might have all of these experiences of anxiety, but not know what it is. Once you can put a label on it and you understand what it is, then you can engage in practices to lower that anxiety. And that is very empowering.
It's not that I'm like freaking out. I have anxiety, and that's what it is. And it can be so helpful to just put that label on it, and it almost in a way helps us understand our experience more, or maybe validate it more. And I totally get that. And for that purpose, I think self-diagnosis is fine. If it just helps for you to better understand your experience and try to hear from other people what they're going through, and then, think, okay, maybe that is what I have. Yeah, it does kind of sound like that.
Yeah. So like if you go through and you realize that you meet all the criteria for BPD, then you start looking at other like BPD YouTubers, or you start doing more reading on it as far as like clinical stuff, and you go like, man, this makes so much sense. Like I'm really connecting with this, all this stuff, like I have all of these symptoms or whatever. I think it can help, even if they're not clinicians, to reach out to other people that are suffering with this, because I'm going to be honest with you, if you don't have BPD, people are not going to be able to understand it. They're not going to understand what it feels like to have that emotional dysregulation, to deal with those anger issues, to split on people. It's hard to explain to people what it actually feels like. It'd be like if you're a trans person and you are familiar with what it's like to dissociate. It's the reason why the text on this stuff is so poorly worded. They'll say, oh, it feels like there's a wall, or it feels like there's like cotton in my head. Like it's very poor physical descriptions, because people that don't dissociate don't understand what it's like for people like us that do experience dissociation. If I said to you, oh, are you dissociated? You know exactly what I'm talking about and what it feels like. Especially once you get that label to say, oh, that's what that feeling is like. When you have like almost like an out-of-body experience or something like that.
Knowing farewell that usually, I would assume, self-diagnoses there's a big margin of error, because we aren't ever able, even as a professional, I'm not able to remove myself from my headspace and body and see myself the way my therapist would see me.
Yeah, and that's why I was saying earlier, a lot of these issues all have like overlapping domains with other ones, so that when you say, oh, like I've experienced paranoia, I experience anxiety, whatever, you all just say like, oh, all of a sudden you have like paranoid personality disorder. And it's like, hopefully if you think that, if you go and you look at the criteria or whatever for it, you might be able to recognize like, well, I meet some of the criteria, but not all of it. Because what a lot of lay people don't know is that you can have ideations for these things without actually being diagnosable. So you could have like a whole lot of the ideation of BPD, but not actually be BPD. Like you might be what might be described as like a borderline personality disorder person. And then of course there's like different levels of functioning depending on how severe your illness is and everything else. Even if you are able to self-diagnose that I have these things, the severity of it, then like exactly what it is, and if you're not actually just you're in the right ballpark, but you just don't get the exact disorder down, it would make it more difficult for you to recover on your own.
You get that? Because even though I can think like a professional, because I diagnose people all the time and I have a lot of clients, and we talk about diagnoses and how we came to this one and why and blah blah blah. But as the person being treated, I can never come out of myself and see myself from the other view and be able to say, I guess that isn't normal.
Yeah, everyone has their own biases, and somebody looking at you and trying to diagnose you is going to have like their set of biases, but you're going to have like a huge amount of them, because all of the thoughts that have gone through your head, and your complete history, whereas the clinician only knows exactly what you've told them or what other people have told them, or what they're inferring from some of the stories and stuff that you've told them. But you actually have all of the data in your head, and that can actually end up being a problem where you do have all these biases, especially because you want to look at yourself in a more favorable light. And that's why, like, I would say is like one of the reasons why you see so few narcissists going in to get treatment. I think there's a reason for that, and I think we all know what it is. And it's because when you're self-diagnosing, if you're going to go into a clinical setting, obviously you think, well, there might be something wrong with me. If somebody has narcissistic personality disorder, it's very unlikely that they're going to think, oh, there's definitely something wrong with me and I need to go get this fixed.
Because I'm going to assume things that have been normal in my life, thought processes that I have are quote unquote normal because that's all I know. Unlike a therapist who can be unbiased and like remove ourselves and be able to say, well, it's actually not that normal to wake up in a panic or to feel your heart race in stress in social situations or whatever we're looking at, whether it's like social anxiety, OCD, different, whatever we're trying to look at. We can't step out of our body and see that because to us that can be the norm, right? That's our baseline. And it takes a professional to be able to recognize that and tell you and kind of reflect back and be like, a lot of people don't experience that. And I want you to understand that that's part of your anxiety. And that.
Yeah, I want to be honest with you. I had in my therapy session, not even like 2 weeks ago, I was talking to my therapist and this exact sort of thing happened. Now, I'm not going to share exactly what it was because it's the internet and y'all don't need to know every fucking thing about me. But I'll say like it was that sort of thing where she was talking to me and she was asking me like, well, what about this or what about that? And I was like, yeah, I feel a little anxious about this and this sort of thing. And then she started asking me like specific anxiety questions about specific objects. And as we went along this, like I'm talking in mid-sentence, then all of a sudden she just asked me, she's like, are you aware that you have a fear of X, Y, and Z? And I scoffed at first and I was like, I don't have that. What are you talking about? Because all I could detect was the anxiety and that it was usually around these certain objects. But she was like, the fear, the anxiety is emanating of your fear of these things. And then once I started realizing it, thinking about it and ruminating, I won't say ruminating, should not ruminate. When I was reflecting on it, I realized that, yeah, I feel like an abnormal amount of anxiety about these objects. So it's that sort of thing where you don't even realize that if you're self-diagnosing, you might say, I realize I have anxiety, but you can't pinpoint exactly where it's coming from. And I think that's more of what Katie's getting at here. And also, I wanted to juxtapose, this clinician's, professional opinion versus my, layperson's opinion and Demon Mama's opinion.
For a lot of people's, the aha light bulb moment where they're like, oh my gosh, that's what it is. I'm not just going crazy. I have blank. So those are kind of my sides to it. I see the benefit of being able to label it for yourself. And I also see the benefit from being able to receive some support online. Facebook is a great resource for that. There's a lot of groups and chats and things like that available for people with blank issue, whether it's depression, anxiety, eating disorder, self-harm, whatever. There are a lot of different groups based around diagnosis or struggles or whatever. And I would encourage you to look for groups like that based around the struggles. If there are groups, depression, if we're feeling down, whether or not we've been clinically depressed, to me doesn't really matter.
All right. So that's pretty much her take on it. And I'm going to make myself, look at that big screen, right? I'm going to just say that hopefully from listening to this, you've been able to gather that I mostly agree with what Demon Mom was saying. I think that there were a few points that I wish that she'd really hammered home more, and that might have been able to bolster her, protect her away from some of the worst criticism that was going to come her way, especially making sure that she specified that anti-vax positions or crystal healing and that kind of stuff is absolutely ludicrous, and it doesn't matter what the person self-diagnoses or what they believe that it's doing. There's no evidence to back this up. And then hopefully it was useful for you to at least hear Katie's position as well and where she's coming from as a clinician. And I think that overall, the way that we talk about mental health, especially in America, is it's awful. And I wish that more people would recognize that there's nothing wrong with reaching out for help. And whether you are depressed or you have suicidal ideation, I will also put the National Suicide Prevention Hotline in my description. I've also tweeted about this numerous times. If you are feeling that depressed, if you please get help, please reach out to somebody. Don't make any permanent decisions on temporary problems. this sort of thing. And very often, if you sit down and talk with somebody, things can get better. And this is for like any mental health condition, whether it requires medication or whether it just requires like a CBT or whatever, or just finding a community that you can reach out to and that you can say, hey, well, what worked for you? And how did y'all get better? And that sort of stuff. And we can help each other out. And I wish that, especially in online spaces, they tend to be so overly toxic that it's like, not only do people not care about the mental health or well-being of the people that they're interacting with, they often lash out at them to make things worse. Like, if somebody did have depression or whatever else, I don't think it's going to help the case if you're just like hounding them endlessly on Twitter. And that was something that I wish would just improve in Discord, in discourse all around. Like, I can't tell you how many conservatives I talk to, especially idiots like Redneck, whatever his name is, on Twitch, where he'll say he cares about like veteran suicide statistics and that sort of stuff, but then he turns around and he memes about 41% trans people, whatever else, and it's like, I can't take you serious. I can't take that you have mental health concerns about other people serious if you're just going to turn around and say like, oh, it's funny or it's hilarious to you that like the trans suicide rate is where it is right now, even though that statistic is also, misrepresented very often. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I know this is like a little bit different. I did not just do a specific like, critique and rip her video apart. I like Demon Mama, like I said. I think she makes a lot of decent content. And even though I don't agree with her on everything, for sure, I will say that if you are offering her the principle of charity and you engage in charitable listening, I think that you can take a lot from her conversations, from her debates. I think it is worthwhile to hear her out. And if you like my channel and subscribe to my channel, hopefully you'll check her stuff out as well. Katie Morton is the psychologist that I had up here. I'll put her link as well. And I will see you in the next video.
Tell me pretty lies, look me in the face, tell me that you love me, even if it's fake.